Hey, welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. My name is Pastor Robey. This is Pastor Justin, and we are starting a very exciting series today in this episode.
We are. Are we going to talk about it or not going to talk about it?
We're going to talk about it. I think we're going to talk about it. If we're not going to talk about it, let's just stop the episode right now.
Okay.
We're going to talk about Encanto and many of its characters.
Yeah, a few episodes on Encanto.
We're going to talk about Encanto. And so today we're going to be talking about the Encanto and the gospel. Where do we find the story of the gospel in Encanto? And why that's important is for a couple reasons, not the least of which is as we're talking about these movies that our kids are watching, our whole families are watching, they're great opportunities to show and talk about the gospel in these stories. Yeah. And so maybe we first start with, why should we expect to see the gospel in these stories? Like, well, why have we if there's storytelling, why would we just expect to find the story of the gospel underneath that story to begin with? Yeah,
there's this principle. Sometimes it's been articulated in different ways, but it's the idea that the stories we mostly love and long for are stories that we love and long for because they remind us or give us a glimpse of the truest story, or of the story we were made for, which is the gospel, the good news of what God has done for us through Jesus. And so there are certain themes that, if you can think of them almost like tunes or these short little melodies that give us like this reminder of the good news of Jesus, the themes of the gospel. And so there's a few themes that we glean from scripture that presents the whole story of the Bible and the truest story in the world. And so when a movie strikes a chord or hits that melody, it reminds us of the story we were all truly made for. And so like one of the themes being redemption. So there's a character who something falls apart, and in the end, everything gets made well, in the end, and that character is somehow restored. So that's one theme that's brought up, but there's others.
Yeah. So, and I think that's right on. I think the reason why we expect to see the gospel in these stories is just like you said, the ultimate author, God, has written a story that we're all longing for. And so as we, being made in his image, we create stories, our humanity creates stories. There are these things deep down we long to be true, and they appear in our stories. And so we can use those things to go back to the true story, the message of the gospel. And so things like redemption, we long for redemption to be true. Self-sacrifice is a big theme. When we see,
almost every fairy tale.
Yeah, there's some kind of self-sacrifice. Unlikely heroes, is another theme. And we see all of those things play out. We long for that. There's something that resonates in us with those stories, and so we can anticipate behind old fairy tales, old mythology, old legend, and even modern stories. We can anticipate those things, and we can even see those in our own lives. Yeah. But it's great to pull those out and to draw out those things for our families and especially for our kids. So, well, let's get to Encanto. Now, let me just start with this. Through this series, this is your one major spoiler alert. If you have not seen Encanto, I mean, it's been out for a little while now, right? So you should be in the clear. If not, pause the podcast now, go watch it, and then come back and listen. Yes. But we're just going to talk about the movie, assuming that you have already watched it. But let's just go to Encanto in particular. Where did you see, as you're watching through that? Yeah. Where do you see the gospel showing up in the movie Encanto?
Yeah. So I think similar to other movies, there's different ways that you can see it play out. However, I think the one that sticks out for me is really the storyline with Abuela's husband, Pedro, and his storyline of what happens with him that really becomes the key to unlocking the whole story. And I think in coming episodes, we're going to explore that dynamic a little more.
And they tell his story. They tell his story twice.
They tell the story twice. So you get a sense of it in the beginning of the movie, but you don't get a fuller understanding of what happened and why she's by herself, why is she a widow, and in all of its fullness until the end of the movie. It really is the climax of it. So it's the moment in the movie. There's a beautiful song. It's written in Spanish about these two caterpillars, and the caterpillars are Abuela and Pedro. And so they're in order for them to be able to grow and blossom and be the butterflies that they're made to be, they have to let each other go. And so the whole storyline, it comes to this point. They have these triplets. It's this really sweet family moment. And they have their kids. They're laughing. Well, then the scene changes, and there's this group of raiders, people who have come and are basically lighting the city on fire, bringing destruction. So Pedro takes his family, they leave their home, and the entire town ends up leaving to try and escape whoever this enemy is. And so as they're escaping, the enemy is coming, on horseback with swords drawn, come to, I guess, take the life of these innocent people. And there's this really tear-jerking moment. I mean, I'm a grown person, and my kids are watching it, and they're tuned in, and I'm like, sobbing, right? And
I won't tell anyone, Justin.
It's
that
okay.
You were crying.
Don't tell anybody.
Okay.
So the dad kisses his children and his wife, and he sends them off, and he turns towards the charging, soldiers that have come to kill them. And he faces them, and he makes a beeline for them. And so he runs to those who are going to, and even waves his arm, and he's trying to stop them as the family kind of watches on. And it is, it's a fairy tale style movie. So there's this magical moment. The mother, Abuela, is crying there, looking at her husband, the love of her life, sacrifice his life to try and save his family. So loving them that he'd be willing to give his own life so that they could be freed. And she's weeping and got tears filled. And that moment becomes the moment, that love and sacrifice becomes what gives them their miracle. And throughout the movie, that's how, things play out. And it all stems from this moment of self-sacrifice and the sheer brokenness of Abuela losing her husband. That's what creates this spark, this light that then is what, defines this family. And so they're at the center of the town. They care for the town, all stemming back from that loving sacrifice.
Yeah. And it's so fun. I mean, the fun of Encanto, I mean, it's visually just beautiful. All the colors.
Oh yeah.
It's so fun. All the family dynamics, they all have the particular things that they contribute to the family that are good and bad. And they all have these magical abilities that make the movie so much fun to watch. But in the gospel, it's all coming back to this one character who sacrifices his life out of love. He squares up to the enemy, sacrifices his life, gives his life, and that creates the miracle. So walk that out. How does that point specifically to Christ?
Yeah. So Jesus comes to this earth with a mission, and he has an understanding of his mission. He tells his disciples, I am going to be delivered over into the hands of sinful men. I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day, I'm going to rise from the dead. And I think of Jesus in the garden just prayerfully resolving in his spirit to obey his Father's will and to go and face up to that enemy, death, sin, and the enemy, the ultimate enemy, the devil. And Jesus, in his death on the cross, is doing the ultimate act of loving sacrifice. And this is the paradigm by which we know love. There's no greater love than this, than you lay down your life for your friends. It's the pattern by which we are to see marriage. Husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So that moment of sacrifice of Jesus is what gives us the salvation, the miracle of salvation that we have, that we can be in relationship with God. And it also reminds me too of just the way it plays out with the main character, Mirabel. She kind of sticks out. She's the only one that doesn't have a miracle, at least not one that you can tangibly see. There are some people who can talk to animals. There's some who can change the weather or heal people with arepas, which is,
that might be a real thing. I mean, arepas they have a power.
They do. You're having a bad day. Yeah. Anyway, we'll get sidetracked on arepas right there.
Go down that road.
So Mirabel, though, she sticks out because she doesn't have some very visual, supernatural miracle, or so she thinks. But really, what she displays is the reflection of the love of her father, or her grandfather, I should say. Yeah. She reflects the love of Pedro. So Pedro's great act of sacrifice to love his family produces this new love that the family then shares within themselves. And that love is really what resolves the movie. It's what brings everyone together. The happy ending that you're looking for or longing for is not going to come through someone's power to change the weather or someone's ability to talk to an animal or all these other miracles. But actually what brings everyone together is the love that was first and foremost demonstrated through Pedro's sacrifice, but then embodied through Mirabel reconciling the family and bringing everyone together.
Yeah, and in a sense, so as Christ also, he is the foundation of the family of God in his sacrifice, and he is built a house, of God's people. And in the same way in Encanto, they have to recapture that. The miracle is the core foundation is not all of their gifts. The core foundation is what the miracle was, which is love. And that love is what will also sustain them. And there's a real beautiful parallel when it comes to the gospel, because we as believers look back to the sacrifice of Christ. We become a family, unexpected family, but by blood, by the blood of Christ, we become a family. But we can lose sight of what the core foundation of that is, which is love. And we go back to the Christ-like love and let that play out, that self-sacrificing Christ-like love. And that's ultimately what ties the family of God together. And so really beautiful, a very strong picture of self-sacrifice. And you can see how we, the creators of Encanto, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but you can see why over and over when a story writer needs an anchor point that shows ultimate love, what they show is self-sacrifice for another. That is and that's biblical. There's no greater love than this, than who will lay down his life. And so we see that same theme of self-sacrifice over and over and over. It's in several other Disney movies as well. And over, it's not just in Disney movies, it's in fairy tales, it's in adventure stories, it's all over, because it's the ultimate expression of love. And we're longing for that kind of love. And we find that in the person of Christ.
Yeah. And I think the other reason, just to get practical, why it's helpful to have these types of conversations is the stories, especially the stories that our kids hear, the stories they hear and I guess watch over and over and over and over again. In the case
and memorize.
And memorize every line of the songs. The stories that you tell inform the views that you hold and inform what you view as normal and set like the cultural just norms of what's, of course, this is the way it should be. All of our sense of what's normal and all of our sense of the way that the world works is informed through these different streams, one of which are is the media that we consume, is the movies and the stories and the books that have shaped our imagination. And so it's helpful, especially as parents, to think through how these stories that our kids are watching and enjoying, how they are shaping their understanding and imagination of the world. And so having conversations like this, like, hey, what does this story remind you of? What happened in the story? Having those conversations helps, for good or for worse, because there's moments when, a character may act in a way that we would certainly not want our kids to act. It's helpful to be able to have those conversations regularly to learn and help make sure that the stories that are forming our kids' minds and imaginations are linking back to the true story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having these kind of dialogues, of course, there are content that we would just say, hey, I don't want that for my family. But the majority of content that our families are gonna absorb is gonna be a mixed bag. I think at one point, Abuela is praying over this candle to
Pedro,
to Abuelo, and of course we would not want our kids to learn that. We would not want to bring that praying to an ancestor or a relative or a loved one that's passed on. We go directly to Jesus. That's important. And we don't go to another person, another saint or someone else. We just pray directly to Jesus. And so we can have that conversation, but there's so many beautiful, redeemable parts that we can also draw out with a simple conversation like, hey, what was the source of that miracle in Encanto? Like maybe after maybe you're on your way to school and you've got the Encanto soundtrack playing in the background, and you can just say, hey, let's just talk for a second about the movie. What was the thing that started all of the miracle with the Encanto? And it was self-sacrifice. And you can just tease that conversation out depending on the age of your kids. What story does that remind you of? And have a conversation about the gospel. And ideally, we as believers and also our children, we're raising them up to know the texture of the gospel, that they can see the world's longing for it in the storytelling, and they can pick up those refrains, like you said, like a musical refrain. They can pick out those notes of the gospel that is embedded in these stories. And all of these stories will give a piece of it, but the one true full gospel is contained in God's word. And it takes us back to, it helps us understand that the world is longing for that and what the hope that we have is in Christ.
That's great. Why don't we close this out?
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us for this episode of the City Rev Life podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on City Rev Life. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate and review wherever you're listening to this. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. For more videos and content, go ahead and check us out at cityrev.org/podcast or download our City Rev Church app. Have a great day.